it's slightly disturbing to see that they are actually successful in convincing people of false facts. Like, for example, there's a number of studies that have been done or polls that have been taken, and people wildly overestimate the number or the percentage of homosexuals in the population. And that's because of the media. That's because of television. Every group of 6 people has their charming gay friend. And so I think the main idea was actually to portray homosexuals as people who live very similar lives to to the straight community, which is, as anyone who's in the music or the arts community knows, is completely not true. But I think that the additional result that they succeeded in convincing people is that there were a lot more gays than there in fact are. And another example is Jews in the United States. It's remarkable when you're watching television, you probably see 5, maybe even 10 times more Jewish characters than you see Southern Baptists or Baptists. And yet, the Baptists in the United States are something like 17% of the population. Jews are 2% and declining. And so, just from a purely statistical point of view, you would think that you would have a lot more Christians in general. You think you would have a lot more Baptists specifically. But for some reason, they consider the Baptists to be a dangerous population that they don't want to portray very accurately. And so, you've always got your little reference to Hanukkah during the Christmas specials and all that sort of thing. And again, it would be reasonable. I suppose that you could cut some slack just because a lot of shows are set in New York City, which does have a high Jewish population. But if you are looking at the entire United States, it's so statistically improbable as to be ridiculous. And so, and now we start to see a pattern. Okay, they're showing a statistically improbable number of interracial couples, and they're only showing one type of interracial couple for the most part. Then they're showing an improbable number of homosexuals. They're showing a ridiculously improbable number of Jews. And that's when you start to realize that there is something going on there. There is some level of cultural programming taking place. And what's even more disturbing about it is how specific some of these programs are. For example, a story came out recently talking about the way that Hollywood, for the last 10 years, has been trying to lay the groundwork for Hillary Clinton's presidency. And so in shows like The Good Wife, Madam Secretary, and a lot more shows, I think they had as many as 10 different shows that had a character who was essentially a stand-in for Hillary Clinton, a blonde woman who wore pantsuits and was either the president or the Secretary of State, who would eventually become the president. And again, what they're trying to do is they're trying to shape reality. They're trying to affect people's subconscious assumptions and then make their desired reality come to pass. And the more that you're aware of this, the more difficult it is for them to convince you that that's the way it should be. On the downside, it does tend to reduce your enjoyment. Just when you see the man behind the curtain, it's not quite as interesting. And what they're really doing is that because they're doing it so bluntly and so crudely, they're showing their hand. Even if you wanted to remain, blind, deaf, and dumb to it, it would be difficult. I occasionally write on Alpha Game, which is the blog that's more focused on human relations, about the way that the cultural programming is really, really aggressively trying to push interracial dating on viewers. Now, I don't think that there's necessarily anything intrinsically wrong with that. With the interracial dating, if two people are interested, so be it. But there is something very, very forced and artificial about it when you see a highly, highly improbable breakdown of couples. And it's not only on the television shows and in the movies, but it's also in the advertising too. I mean, it's so absurd. Over here in Europe, we tend to watch English TV, and the racial demographics in England are very different than they are in the United States, and there's a lot fewer blacks or Africans, and there's a lot more Arabs, Asians, right? But what's remarkable is that on the advertisements, there's this tremendously high percentage, improbably high percentage of black men and white women in the commercials. At one point, in fact, I counted something like 9 over the course of a single half-an-hour television show versus 7 white-on-white couples. And at one point, my wife joked that that must be all the interracial, the black male, white female couples in England, because I mean, it just doesn't exist. It's not probable, and so you have to ask yourself, okay, why are they pushing that? Why, if nothing else, in that particular case, why do we always see the black male, white female coupling when actually the white male, Asian female coupling is statistically much more likely, especially in England, but you don't.
Well, and it's interesting because the stats for interracial marriages are not always that great, right? I mean, higher probabilities of breakup and so on. And what's interesting about the interracial couple thing, which I see a lot of as well, is it's always prior to kids. Because, of course, the challenge with interracial couples, as it is with interfaith couples and so on to some degree, is how are you going to raise the kids, in which culture, in which ethnicity, and so on. And these are complicated questions which are difficult to answer. And I think a lot of sort of interracial romances occur prior to kids being in the picture, because then it becomes more complicated. But they don't usually deal with the challenges of interracial dating, which of course is, that people grow up with different ethnicities, and according to a lot of the leftists, different ethnicities have different experiences of the world. And this general push, without dealing with the challenges of it, I think paints a bit too rosy of a picture for what can sometimes, and statistically is often, more of a challenging relationship.
Well, there's no question. I mean, I'm triracial myself. I'm European, I'm Mexican, and I'm Native American. And there have been. I'm trying to think. My generation is doing okay with only one divorce, but my parents are divorced, and a lot of people don't realize how much pressure that those sort of differences can make on either a marital or a non-marital relationship. Now, I don't think that really had anything to do with my parents' breakup. They had other pressures that were considerably more. But the fact of the matter is that it's not something that should be celebrated, simply because it would be like encouraging people to marry alcoholics, or encourage people to marry people who are psychologically unstable. I mean, these are all risk factors for marriages, and yet here you've got, and the irony is that that particular combination, black male, white female, is actually the worst and least likely to succeed combination. In fact, if they were to push black female, white male, that is actually more likely to stay married than two black people or two white people or two Asians. And yet you don't see that as much. So again, it is quite clearly intentional, and it is quite clearly being pushed